My name is Josh Sayles. I'm the Director of Jewish Community and Government Relations for the Greater Miami Jewish Federation. And I'm joined by Ruban Roberts, immediate past president of the Miami-Dade branch of the NAACP. And we're excited to be moderating a virtual conversation with Crime on the Bayou's director, writer, producer, extraordinaire, Nancy Buirski. I hope I'm saying that correctly, Nancy.
Close enough.
Okay. So I think we'll start with an easy one, Nancy. Well, first of all, I just want to say how much I enjoyed and learned from this documentary, and of all of the stories you could have chosen to tell in order to highlight racism in the South during the civil rights movement. Why'd you choose this?
That's such a great question. Interestingly, it kind of ties together two other films that I worked on previously. I made a film called The Loving Story, which was about Richard and Mildred Loving, an interracial couple who were arrested in 1958 in Virginia. And one of the things that struck me about them, and particularly Mildred Loving, was the fact that though their case, which ultimately went to the Supreme Court, did change history and overruled all the anti-miscegenation statutes in the country, Mildred Loving was not an activist. She did not set out to change history. Similarly, Recy Taylor, in my film that followed a few years later called The Rape of Recy Taylor, stood up for herself and spoke up for herself after she had been gang raped in Alabama in 1944. So here are two individuals who were not activists, who were not setting out to change history, and yet did the right thing. And in doing so, they did change history. Well, Gary Duncan, to me, is a very similar kind of protagonist or hero of our film, as is his lawyer, Richard Sobel. And their story is very much like the other two, that they're little known. Most people don't know very much about any of these stories. They certainly know more about the Loving story, I'm happy to say, once our film came out. And then we also made a feature called Loving. And anyone who had studied the law knew that case. The Rape of Recy Taylor was also, sadly, very little known. And this one too, though it too goes to the Supreme Court. And so here we have 2 out of 3 films that deal with Supreme Court cases, but about which we know very little. The protagonists of these cases we don't even know who these real people are. So that's a long-winded way of saying that's what interested me in this story.
So thank you, Nancy, so much. I love your body of work. And I thank you for bringing this awareness to our society at large. And this last work that you did, I just wanted to know, I have a couple of questions. One is, what made you decide to give voice to this particular incident in the civil rights movement? And was it a conscious effort for you to intertwine the racism and anti-Semitism that in the film? That's one. And then the other thing I'd like for you to speak to is about the parallels that you see from that you speak about in your films with what's going on today. Oh
boy, do you have 4 hours? Well, let's deal with the decision to discuss not only racism but anti-Semitism. It was I hate to say it was kind of a no-brainer because it was happening. You know, the white supremacists who basically ruled Plaquemines Parish, Leander Perez and his cronies, were as angry at Jews as they were at blacks. It's sometimes more so because the Jews were the ones who were organizing, and they were the ones who were they felt they were getting the blacks riled up. That wasn't necessarily the case, but that's what Perez would say. The fact is that Gary Duncan's father was a member of the NAACP during that time. So he was, though Gary was not an activist, his father was very committed to change through working through the NAACP. And along with the NAACP arrived these Jewish lawyers during that time who felt a connection to the struggle. You know, when we think about it, this is taking place in the 60s. That's 2 decades after the Holocaust. And so many of the Jews who felt connected to the struggle, and particularly Jewish lawyers who felt they could actually do something concretely to help, were doing so because they were connecting to that suffering. And so we felt it was really important to address that. But I mean, not just because the Jews who participated felt strongly about it, but it's important to understand what white nationalism is. White nationalism is both anti-racist and anti-Semitic and anti-Catholic. I mean, there are just so many antis embedded in that hateful philosophy that it's very important to lift that up and make sure that people understand that. And that, I guess, also answers your second question, which is the timeliness of it. We're seeing so much of that today. Going back to Charlottesville a couple of years ago, all of it is, you know, the tone of what's going on in this country was set in the past administration. And fortunately, we're now finished with that, but it doesn't mean that, you know, an awful lot of people don't connect to that philosophy, if you want to call it that, and it's something to be concerned with. So to us, it was important to look at history and see it through the lens of history and understand how what we're looking at today is something that didn't just start today. We know that white supremacy started a long time ago. I mean, that goes back to, you know, it goes back to slavery, frankly. But, you know, when we see it crop up and have an impact on the culture, it's happened over and over and over again in the course of history. And I think that we really do need to consider that carefully and understand that maybe our film is not history at all. Maybe it's reality reconsidered.
That's a really important point, and I just want to elaborate on what Ruben asked a little bit further, right? In talking about white supremacy, right? Charlottesville was 2017, and one of the things that stands out in my head to talk about another film that kind of calls some of the Black and the Jewish issues, brings them together, is watching, you know, Spike Lee's not the Black Klansman, Black Klansman, yeah. And right at the end of that movie, they show scenes from Charlottesville, and I just remember getting chills watching the credits at the end of that movie. Can you talk about maybe some of the similarities or the differences that you see in how white supremacism reveals itself today versus maybe how it would in Leander Perez's county, or if there aren't any differences? Speak to that.
I'm glad you mentioned Black Klansman, because I find myself mentioning it more and more when I'm writing, when I'm fundraising. I mean, I think we're one of the only films after Black Klansman that really has made this point and create, you know, considers it such an important theme in our film. It's a toxic kind of triangulation of white supremacy, anti-Semitism, and racism. And I don't think that one can be removed from the other. I think that what we saw happening in Plaquemines Parish, Louisiana, was a perfect example of how white supremacy embeds itself into institutions.
Right.
It's not just a bunch of people waving banners, getting excited, and riling people up. That it's what we call institutional racism or institutional bias. And so Leander Perez, who was kind of like the mob boss of that time, had his hands, I mean, he was a judge for a very short time, but he was called the judge for years after, because he had so much control over that parish. And he had that control financially by siphoning off oil revenues and channeling into building projects in the parish. Ruben, you're shaking your head. It looks like you know a lot about this. But he also has control by having his hands on all the elected and appointed officials in that parish. And they all do his bidding because they all owe him one. You know, he's so busy building, you know, schools and roads. It's very hard for people to ignore him. So it's kind of like back office politics. And that's where white supremacy really gains its power, is through that kind of structural control. Do we see that today? I mean, listen, we just saw someone leave the White House that had a very similar kind of control over a community of white nationalists, we call them today. But I think that in Leander Paris, I think what our film shows is how directly you can observe the mechanics of white supremacy through the courts and through what we call pretend law. That was another theme in our movie, that, you know, the law that was practiced in the Deep South was ersatz law. You know, it didn't pay attention to the Constitution. And that's what a lot of these lawyers were interested in doing. When they wanted to change things, they wanted to make sure that we actually embrace, I shouldn't say we, but the lawyers and the legal system in the Deep South made sure that they were embracing actual law, not pretend law.
Wow, there's a lot that you've unpacked, and I'm telling you, I have so many questions to ask you. I know our time is limited, but I want to say to you, I agree with you with a lot of what you're saying, but you know, we must look back in the Constitution and the 3/5 compromise. So when you don't see people as human, you know, you don't treat them as human. They're not subject to the same laws that you're subject to, you know, that white men are subject to. I mean, and this is not just Black people, it's women as well.
Yeah.
And so one of the things, and this is so befitting to talk about this during Women's History Month, but I want to say to you and ask you a question. One of the things that really stood out to me about all of the films that we spoke about, your repertoire, and then also with Spike Lee, one of the common threads to me that I see is that at some point, there needs to be an acknowledgement of this white supremacy. And there needs to be some movement around really addressing it. This recent insurrection, what I saw is that you had two camps. You had some folks that want to deny that what they did was an insurrection, that this was something totally against the government. You have some politicians saying that, you know, I'm more concerned about Antifa and Black Lives Matter than I am from those folks who rioted and stormed the Capitol. And to me, I want to know, through your body of work, through your research and that sort of thing, what recommendations or what can be done to really bring this to the forefront? Because I'm a strong believer is that silence gives consent. So I know that, you know, Black folks, Jewish folks, for the most part, are really, you know, sounding the alarm. But we need more than just the Black and the Jewish community to get involved. So what do you think can happen to really address this issue of this white supremacy and hatred above all, you know, because that's what it is. What can be done to really address it?
Oh boy. I wish I had the answer. I know you do too, right? You're asking me a question that you really probably don't have an answer to, but it's very powerful question and set of problems that we have. You know, we start by telling the kinds of stories that filmmakers like I did, and, you know, Spike Lee, of course, does it in every single one of his movies. You know, there is at the core of this film, the heartbeat of this film is this friendship between Gary Duncan and Richard Sobel. And if you can show how these two people come together, and by the way, until Richard Sobel's death, which was just a year ago in March, they were very close friends. That was a deep and very powerful friendship. So you show how these people can come together and actually change things. That can be one step. It's not everything. We need a lot more, you know, people who are concerned with these issues to speak up. And, you know, I hate to say it, but, you know, if we can do it in a nonviolent way, I think that we are more inclusive. The people that get nervous about, you know, violence. Look, I don't think that white supremacists are ever going to be nonviolent. I think it's too much to ask. And I am totally supportive of Black Lives Matter. And if that ends up, if there are times when there's frustration and as a result of some really tragic events, who am I to say one should not be violent? I don't know. I don't know what the answer is, but I think that the more that we can open dialogue and more we can embrace each other and find compassion with each other's problems, the closer we will get to solving these problems. But I am concerned, Ruben, about white supremacists who see things through blinders and only one lens. I think when we can bring them together and have actual conversations, and we've seen this happen in history, look at George Wallace. There are times when there are people who feel very strident about one thing, and they somehow get convinced to be in the room with other people and have that conversation and understand that those people that they're so afraid of are human beings just like themselves. Then there can be change. I mean, I think that's what we say this in The Loving Story, that in a way, segregation is really about people not being able to be in the same place together and then just develop friendships and maybe develop love. And that's so scary to so many people. So, it's all about, to me, it's a lot of it. It's about getting in the same room. But no easy answers, believe me. Not being a Black person myself, there are things that I probably can't ever understand the way a Black person will understand them. But I'm very much trying to, understand it with the help of a lot of colleagues of mine who are of color to tell these stories.
I think that you don't have to be Black. I think you just have to be human and see the humanity in people. But people first have to recognize you as human. And so you're absolutely right. For you to embark on the journey that you've done shows that you can appreciate and understand the humanity in people, and that you acknowledge, you see us, you hear us as human beings, as people. And I greatly appreciate you for that.
Thank you.
I think, to your point too, Ruben, I think that, and to Nancy's, talking about how, like, you can't expect white supremacists to not be violent. And to Ruben, your point about how seeing everybody as human, and I think that that's kind of the extraordinary leadership of people like Dr. Reverend Martin Luther King or Gandhi, who even under the subject of such violence are able to see the other side as human and to maintain these nonviolent movements where it just, I think that human element is what made them such incredible leaders. I want to ask a very naive question as somebody who is a white person. There's a very short clip, Angela Davis speaking in the documentary, and she says she's ambivalent about the word ally because what white people need to understand is that racism impacts them as much as it impacts Black people. And I have no question that racism, even for people who are at the top of the caste, affects them negatively and affects their lives and their livelihoods negatively. But I also have I personally can't make the argument that racism in Louisiana around the civil rights movement impacted Gary Duncan and Leander Perez equally. So I would just love to hear you reflect on that.
Well, that last part of your comment is obviously a very literal one. I think we would all agree that it didn't literally impact them that way. But the way I interpreted Angela Davis's statement was that we are all affected by poisonous behavior. We are all affected by hate. And even if we are not the exact targets of that hate, it's insidious. It's going to seep into us. Even if we're the ones that are practicing the hate, to me, it's a disease. And so I think in a way that's what she's saying, that even if we were complicit, even if we're at, the white supremacists who consider themselves the master class, that's going to pull them down. That's going to, you've probably heard many stories of white supremacists who've on their deathbeds regretted or apologized because they've been living with that hate their whole lives. And, I think that's kind of what she's saying, that look, race is to me the American story. It's the American tragedy. We are all a part of that. Are we suffering day in and day out like people of color are? No, of course not. We're not feeling those microaggressions that happen as you walk down the street, or go into a store. As one of our characters says, just walking down the street as a Black person is a political act. So we're not suffering from that day in and day out. But in general, overall, philosophically, spiritually, we are suffering. And if we're not, then we're not in touch with some kind of human part of ourselves.
Again, so Josh, I have to piggyback on what Nancy says, and I want to say to you, you had a recent example of this. You have a recent example of what Angela Davis spoke to. When the white supremacists came onto the Capitol, they were addressing their concerns about losing leadership that really supported them. And they were willing to hurt white people.
Yeah.
So when you say, how does it affect them? Exactly. They're willing, because you are against what they are about, they're willing to not just hurt you, but kill you. The same police officers that they're supposed to be supporting, they harmed and killed them. And so that shows you the extent of that hate and how it permeates and how it affects even the perpetrator of hate, because there's no end. Where does it end? When you're willing to hurt someone that you're supposed to be supporting because they don't agree with you. And I think that's where the ambivalence that Angela Davis spoke to really rung so loudly and so true. I want to ask you, Nancy, what's next? What's next on the horizon? What are you doing? What do we have to look forward to? I am so excited about your work, and I would love to know what do you have next on the agenda?
Well, thank you so much. All my films have not been in this space. The three films that I mentioned before, The Loving Story, Rape of Buirski Taylor, and From on the Bayou, have kind of formed a trilogy. And by the way, I didn't set out to do that. It was just one story would come and then another, and before I knew it, they were connected. Kind of elegantly, I felt that I couldn't not do it. But other films that I've made, one was on a ballet dancer who was sadly a very beautiful dancer at the height of her career in the 50s, was stricken with polio and was paralyzed and was never able to dance again. And I had to ask herself the question, who am I? Because she had gained so much of her power and her sense of self as a dancer. Sidney Lumet, who I also did a film on, a great director who did Serpico and Dog Day Afternoon and Network and films of that ilk, also finds himself asking himself that question, who am I? Because he witnesses a kind of immoral act, and he doesn't act the way he would have hoped he would have acted. And so, I guess that whatever films I make are always going to deal with these kinds of questions of morality and who we are. How do we stand up? Mildred Loving and Reese Taylor and Gary Duncan, they stand up for themselves because it's the essence of a good life, which this is what Sidney Lumet says. That's the essence of a good life, to be independent and work against the mob, work against corrupt forces. So I'm not sure what the next film will be, but I hope that in some way it will be addressing some of the same questions. I am actually working on taking, the ballet film is called Afternoon of a Faun. And by the way, people can watch that on Amazon and iTunes, Amazon, the normal streaming channels. I'm working on turning that into a narrative film. So I'm writing a script for that. And that's probably where I'll be putting most of my energy in the near future. Thank you for asking. I love finding ways that these things all come together.
You have, I think we're coming towards the end of the interview. I just wanted to ask you, do you have a favorite anecdote from documentary that you want to share, or any final few words that you think the audience should know?
I can say that I was delighted to be able to show this film to Richard Sobel before he passed. And Gary Duncan was there as well. We were at Richard Sobel's house in California, as was the author of the book that this is inspired by, a book called Deep Delta Justice, Matt Van Meter. So we were all there watching the film together. And Richard was so moved. He'd been kind of reluctant to do the film initially because he didn't want so much attention on him. He just felt this was more Gary's story, and he didn't understand how powerful we would understand, how we would understand how powerful their relationship was. But he said it was one of the best days of his life. And he passed 3 weeks later. So that was really important to me. I guess that's what comes to mind first and foremost. So thank you so much for allowing me to talk so deeply about these issues. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you so much, Nancy. I really enjoyed the time to talk with you, and I'm hoping that we can continue this conversation offline. So I'm looking forward to following up with you.
I've asked for your email, so I'm looking forward to doing that. And Josh, thank you so much. Same with you. This has been a really very important conversation.
Thank you guys for joining. Thank you, Nancy. Thank you, Ruben, and to the NAACP. And thanks again to all of our sponsors, our community partners, our volunteers, our film lovers, and especially SAGE, the Center for Advancement of Jewish Education, and the Greater Miami Jewish Federation. Thank you all for joining us.